The pine bark was stripped away in a perfect ring, exactly 12 feet above the soil line. I stood in the clearing near Truckee Lake and looked up at the cut marks. The axe strikes were clean, preserved by the dry summer air. It was August when I arrived, but the marks told the story of February. To cut wood at that height, a man had to be standing on 12 feet of packed snow. In the spring of 1846, 89 emigrants set out for California under the command of George Donner. By the time the snows melted the following year, only 48 remained. The rest were swallowed by the Sierra Nevada. I came to the mountains to document what they left behind. The expedition began in Springfield, Illinois, on April 14, 1846. The core of the group consisted of two families, the Donners and the Reeds. George Donner was 62 years old, a farmer of substantial means, traveling with his wife Tamsen and their children. James Fraser Reed was 45, an Irish-born businessman who had designed a massive, custom-built wagon for his family. The local press called it the Palace Wagon. It featured spring-cushioned seats, a built-in iron stove, and a second level for sleeping. It required 8 oxen to pull it. The physical weight of their ambition was immense. I reviewed the ledgers of their provisions. They carried barrels of flour, sacks of cornmeal, kegs of salt pork, 100-pound sacks of sugar, and chests of dried beans. They packed augers, draw knives, crosscut saws, and heavy iron chains. They brought bolts of cotton canvas, spools of heavy twine, and crates of glass beads for trading. The wagons were loaded to the canvas roofs. The initial journey to Independence, Missouri, took 4 weeks. The weather was mild, the roads were dry, and the oxen were fresh. In Independence, they joined a larger wagon train commanded by Colonel William H. Russell. The combined train numbered nearly 500 wagons, a moving city of canvas and timber stretching for miles across the prairie. The early weeks on the California Trail were marked by routine. They woke at dawn, yoked the oxen, walked 15 miles, and formed a circle at dusk. They crossed the Kansas River on May 26. They reached the Platte River in early June. The journals from this period reflect a methodical, almost monotonous progress. The grass was abundant, and the water was clear. There was no indication of the delays that would later compound into disaster. They were moving at the standard pace of the 1846 emigration, aiming to cross the Sierra Nevada before the first snows of November. The margin for error on the 2,000-mile journey was always narrow, measured in weeks and days. Every broken axle, every strayed ox, every swollen river subtracted from that margin. As they moved westward toward the Continental Divide, the wagon settled into the deep ruts left by thousands of previous emigrants. The trail was a known quantity, mapped and measured by those who had gone before. But the leaders of the Donner and Reed families were carrying a newly published guidebook, one that promised a faster route to the California coast. By July 1846, the train reached Fort Laramie, Wyoming. Here, James Reed encountered an old friend, a seasoned mountain man named James Clyman. Clyman had just come from California, riding eastward. He warned Reed against taking a new, untested route known as the Hastings Cutoff. The cutoff was promoted by Lansford Hastings in his book, The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. Hastings claimed his route, which cut south of the Great Salt Lake, would save the emigrants nearly 400 miles. Clyman told Reed the route was a desert wasteland, entirely unfit for heavy wagons. He advised them to stick to the established trail through Fort Hall. Reed listened, but the allure of saving weeks of travel was strong. On July 19, the train reached the Little Sandy River in present-day Wyoming. This was the point of divergence. The established trail went right, toward Fort Hall. The Hastings Cutoff went left, toward Fort Bridger. The emigrants held a meeting to decide their course. A splinter group of 20 wagons, containing 89 people, chose the cutoff. They elected George Donner as their captain. From that day forward, they were the Donner Party. They arrived at Fort Bridger on July 27. Fort Bridger was not a military installation, but a pair of crude log cabins operated by the trader Jim Bridger. Hastings himself was not there, he had already departed westward, guiding another group of wagons. He left instructions for the Donner Party to follow his tracks. Bridger assured Reed that the cutoff was a fine, level road, with plenty of water and grass. I have read the letters Reed sent back to Springfield from this location. They are filled with optimism. He wrote that they expected to reach the San Francisco Bay in 7 weeks. They rested their oxen for 4 days at Fort Bridger, repairing yokes and tightening the iron tires on their wagon wheels. On July 31st, they left the fort and turned their wagons onto the Hastings Cutoff. The trail initially led through the Uinta Mountains, a manageable ascent. But within a week, the terrain shifted. The tracks left by Hastings' lead group disappeared into a narrow, boulder-choked ravine called Weber Canyon. Here, they found a note from Hastings stuck to a sagebrush. The note warned them that the canyon ahead was impassable for wagons. He instructed them to halt and send a messenger ahead to find him, so he could show them an alternate route through the Wasatch Mountains. The Donner Party stopped. They had left the no map. They were now waiting for directions in a landscape of James Reed rode ahead on horseback to find Hastings. He returned days later with a rough sketch of a new route through the Wasatch Mountains. The 89 emigrants, with their 20 heavy wagons, had to cut their own road. I walked the path they took through Emigration Canyon. The brush is thick oak and willow, the slopes are steep, and the ground is littered with limestone outcroppings. The men swung axes and picks from dawn until dusk, clearing a path just wide enough for the wagon wheels. They locked the wheels with chains and skidded the wagons down the steep drops. It took them 21 days to cover 36 miles. By the time they emerged from the Wasatch Mountains on August 22, the oxen were exhausted, and the emigrants were physically depleted. They had lost 3 weeks of travel time. Ahead of them lay the Great Salt Lake Desert. Hastings' guidebook claimed the desert crossing would take 2 days and cover 40 miles. The emigrants filled every available cask and pitcher with water and gathered bundles of grass for the oxen. They entered the Salt Flats on August 30th. The surface of the desert was a thin crust of white salt over a bottomless mire of gray mud. The heavy wagons broke through the crust. The wheels sank to the axles. The oxen, already weakened by the Wasatch crossing, could not pull the loads. The sun beat down, reflecting off the white salt, pushing temperatures into the 90s. The crossing did not take 2 days. It took 6. The distance was not 40 miles, it was 80. In the middle of the desert, the thirst drove the oxen mad. 36 cattle broke free from their yokes and ran off into the shimmering heat, never to be recovered. Without oxen, wagons could not move. The emigrants were forced to abandon 4 wagons in the salt, transferring whatever provisions they could carry into the remaining vehicles. James Reed lost all his oxen and had to abandon his palace wagon. He and his family walked the rest of the desert on foot. When they finally reached the springs at the base of Pilot Peak, they spent a week resting and searching the desert for the lost cattle. The search was futile. By the time they resumed their journey in mid-September, the inventory of the Donner Party was severely reduced. They were short on draft animals, short on food, and critically short on time. The nights were growing cold. The September frost hardened the mud on the wagon wheels. They had survived the cutoff, but the delays had consumed their safety margin. The Sierra Nevada still lay. The trail followed the Humboldt River across the Nevada basin. The water was alkaline, and the grass was sparse. The constant physical strain began to fracture the discipline of the group. On October 5, at a sandy hill near present-day Golconda, Nevada, 2 wagons became entangled. A teamster named John Snyder began whipping his oxen. James Reed intervened. The altercation escalated quickly. Snyder struck Reed in the head with the butt of his bullwhip. Reed drew a hunting knife and drove it into Snyder's chest. Snyder died within minutes. The emigrants convened a makeshift council. They banished Reed from the train, forcing him to ride ahead alone, leaving his wife and children behind. The party moved on, leaderless and fractured. The Paiute tribes along the Humboldt, observing the weakened state of the train, began shooting the remaining oxen with poisoned arrows at night. By the time the Donner Party reached the Truckee Meadows, near present-day Reno, on October 20th, they had lost more than 100 head of cattle. They halted in the meadows for 5 days to rest the surviving animals. It was a fatal delay. The sky above the mountains to the west turned a heavy, leaden gray. On October 31st, the lead wagons reached the base of the final ascent, a steep, rocky climb to a pass above Truckee Lake. The elevation was 7,000 feet. The temperature dropped. The rain turned to sleet, and then to snow. The emigrants attempted to push the wagons up the granite slopes, but the snow was already 3 feet deep. The oxen lost their footing. The canvas covers grew heavy with ice. They unyoked the animals and tried to pack the supplies on their backs, but the snow continued to fall, burying the trail entirely. On November 3rd, they made one final attempt to reach the summit on foot. They waded into snowdrifts that reached their chests. The wind sounded like a saw cutting through the pine branches. 5 miles from the summit, they realized they could go no further. The pass was blocked. They turned around and retreated to the eastern shore of Truckee Lake. George Donner's wagon had broken an axle miles behind, and his family, along with several others, halted at Alder Creek, 6 miles from the lake. The party was now split into 2 camps. The snow did not stop. It fell for 8 days straight. The emigrants were trapped. They had no winter clothing, no insulated shelters, and their remaining food was calculated to. At Truckee Lake, the emigrants constructed 3 crude shelters. One was an existing, abandoned cabin built by a previous party. The other 2 were built by leaning pine logs against large granite boulders, roofing them with canvas and ox hides. At Alder Creek, the Donner families had no time to build cabins. They pitched canvas tents and piled brush around the bases to block the wind. I have studied the weather logs kept by Patrick Breen, an emigrant in the lake camp. His entries are brief and methodical. November 20th. Came on to snow thick. Wind west. November 29th. Still snowing. Now about 3 feet deep. By December, the snow depth reached 12 feet. The cabins were entirely buried. The emigrants had to dig sloping tunnels up to the surface just to breathe. The cold was absolute. The temperature routinely dropped below zero. Inside the dark, smoke-filled cabins, 81 people waited. They slaughtered the remaining oxen, but the meat was consumed quickly. They began to boil the ox hides, turning the leather into a thick, glue-like paste. They charred the bones and ate the ash. They hunted for mice. The silence of the camps was heavy, broken only by the wind and the coughing of the children. On December 15th, Baylis Williams died of malnutrition. He was the first. Realizing that rescue would not come, 15 of the strongest emigrants, 10 men and 5 women, fashioned crude snowshoes from ox boughs and rawhide. On December 16th, they climbed out of the camp and headed for the pass, determined to reach California and bring back help. History calls them the Forlorn Hope. They carried 6 days of starvation rations. They disappeared into the white expanse, leaving the remaining 66 people in the camps to wait. January brought the heaviest storms of the winter. Breen's diary records snow falling for weeks without a break. The drifts reached 20 feet. The emigrants at Alder Creek were entirely cut off from the lake camp. Communication ceased. The daily routine was reduced to gathering firewood, a task that required immense effort from starving bodies. Men would climb the snow tunnels, cut branches from the upper reaches of the pine trees, and drag them back down. As the food vanished entirely, the deaths accelerated. The bodies were carried up the tunnels and laid in the snowbanks. The record of what happened next in the dark cabins is fragmented, pieced together from later testimonies and the physical evidence left in the hearths. The emigrants did what the biology of survival demanded. On the western side of the mountains, James Reed and others who had crossed before the snow spent months trying to organize a rescue. The Mexican-American War was underway, and able-bodied men and supplies were scarce. Finally, in early February 1847, a rescue party of 14 men, known as the First Relief, set out from Sutter's Fort. They carried heavy packs of beef and flour, marching on foot up the western slope. The snow was so deep they had to leave their pack animals behind at Bear Valley. On February 18th, 7 men of the First Relief crested the pass and looked down at Truckee Lake. They saw no cabins, no wagons, no smoke. Only a flat expanse of white snow. They shouted into the silence. Minutes later, a woman emerged from a hole in the snowpack. It was an emigrant named Murphy. She looked at the men and asked if they were from California or from heaven. The rescuers descended into the camps. The conditions they found were severe. The cabins were filled with the stench of unwashed bodies, wood smoke, and death. The survivors were emaciated, their skin drawn tight over their bones, their voices reduced to whispers. The rescuers distributed small rations of food, careful not to kill the starving people with sudden abundance. They traveled the 6 miles to Alder Creek to check on the Donner families. They found George Donner suffering from a severe infection in his hand, unable to walk. Tamsen Donner refused to leave her husband. The First Relief could not carry the weak. They had to select those strong enough to walk out. On February 22, the rescuers departed the lake camp with 23 refugees, mostly women and children. The march back over the pass was grueling. The refugees had to step exactly in the footprints of the rescuers. If they stepped off the packed trail, they sank to their waists. They walked in single file, a slow, dark line against the glaring white snow. Several children died on the trail out, their bodies left in the snowbanks. The First Relief met the Second Relief, led by James Reed, moving up the mountain. Reed was finally returning for his family. The First Relief continued down to the valley, while Reed pushed upward toward the lake, knowing that dozens of people were. The Second and Third Reliefs reached the camps in March. With each arrival, the camps were quieter. The snow began to melt, revealing the refuse of the winter. The rescuers found the remains of the dead, heavily scavenged. They found journals, scattered coins, and the rusted iron of the wagon wheels. The final rescue party, the Fourth Relief, arrived in April. They found only one man alive, Louis Kesselberg, surrounded by the bones of his former companions. George and Tamsen Donner were dead. The camps were abandoned to the elements. In June 1847, General Stephen Kearny crossed the pass with a military detachment. He ordered his men to gather the remains, place them in the Breen cabin, and set the structure on fire. The flames consumed the logs, the canvas, and the bones, leaving only a square of scorched earth. I walked the perimeter of the Alder Creek camp, mapping the locations of the hearths. We found lead shot, broken china, and the brass buckles of wagon harnesses. We found thousands of fragmented, calcined bones, chopped into pieces less than an inch long. The physical evidence confirms the desperate measures taken to extract marrow and grease. But the archaeological record has limits. We know that 41 people died. We know the exact dimensions of the cabins. We know the depth of the snow. What remains unknown is the sequence of the final weeks at Alder Creek. George Donner kept a detailed journal throughout the journey. Tamsen Donner was a botanist and a writer who kept meticulous notes. Neither of their journals was ever found. The Fourth Relief reported seeing books and papers scattered in the melting snow, ruined by the water. The daily record of the Donner family's survival, their conversations, and their final days was lost to the spring thaw. The exact timeline of who died when, and how the survivors endured the final month of isolation, is gone. The mountain kept the ledger. If these stories of vanished crews and silent ships speak to you, subscribe to the Lost Atlas.